my pleasure to welcome Jason Hartlove from Nanosys to come up and tell us about where they are and what's happening. And Nanosys is one of the companies that a QD company that's been around since the beginning and has done some amazing stuff and really pushed the field forward. So it's a pleasure to have Jason here speak. Thanks.
Pleasure to see you all. Lots of familiar faces out there. Really honored to be here today, and it's fantastic to see the progress that the industry's made. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about UHD in particular, which I think is a natural potential technology inflection point for display technologies moving into this space. Whenever there is a new standard, whenever there is a compelling reason for consumers to be upgrading to the next generation of devices, this provides an opportunity for new technologies to be infused into the marketplace. We've seen this many times, not to ring the Apple bell too many times, but of course, lots of fundamental changes happened when they brought the smartphone to market, that opened up a wide industry. When we see things like UHD emerging on the horizon, that becomes also very interesting for all of us, I think, in terms of rates with which new technologies can be adopted. So first, a little bit about our company. Nanosys was founded in 2001, as Jonathan said, so not really a startup anymore at 14 years old. We're the first company to focus on quantum dots for electronics. We have the #1 quantum dot IP position with over 200 worldwide granted patents and over 75 pending. We have technology in-house, which have been exclusively licensed from MIT, Lawrence Berkeley, Life Technologies, Philips Lumileds, and many others. We've been profitable for 6 quarters in a row with consecutive cash flow positive quarters. We saw significant revenue growth in 2014 on the backs of many of the products that we see coming to market this year. As many of you may know, our business model is to be making the world's best quantum dot materials. And so as a result of being very early in the supply chain, our revenue tends to lead the product introduction revenue by sometimes as much as 2 to 3 quarters. We operate a 60,000-foot manufacturing facility, state-of-the-art manufacturing facility. It's the largest quantum dot material production facility in the world in Silicon Valley. And we have installed capacity today to deliver enough quantum dot material to our partners, such as 3M, to make more than 6 million 60-inch class TVs on an annual basis. Again, our business model is to manufacture and sell the world's best quantum dot materials. We have also, since we've been in this for a very long time, we've also designed component instantiations of how to use these materials in end products, such as films and other types of form factors. So we have developed a lot of know-how around this type of component manufacturer. And while we're not a component manufacturer, we do help our partners by doing technology transfer and licensing of that technology to them. That, in turn, having those partners and their commercial scale, helps us get those components into the end market, into the hands of the display and set makers. And then, of course, we're continuing to develop an innovative new display technologies and materials. QDEF, you heard about earlier from one of the other presentations. It's basically a replacement film for the diffuser in the backlight unit stack. Thanks for covering that. I don't have to spend any time on it. So today's topic outline is basically, I'm going to give you a little background about UHD and the requirements of UHD for better pixels. From there, we're going to move into how we can use quantum dots to improve LCD pixels to achieve the requirements of Rec 2020, and also talk a little bit about alternative ways to do that and further optimizations that might be possible to get to 100% compliance to the Rec 2020 standard. So first, background about UHD and the requirements for better pixels. So as was previously mentioned, this is from the NHK website, what they call Super High Vision, which is the broadcast standard for UHD. Super High Vision is, of course, about resolution, so we have more pixels. It's also about frame rates, and so we have faster pixels. But really, we also have better pixels, and I'm not sure. It looks like that might have gotten a little bit clipped there, but we're talking about 12 bits per pixel, and we're talking about a Rec 2020 wide color gamut colorimetry. And so when we talk about that in conjunction with these other features, then you begin to build a very compelling user experience for UHD. It's not just about resolution. So why all this talk about color, and why is color so important to us? As was mentioned in the Samsung talk, 80% of the information that we process is visual. More than 25% of the brain's visual cortex takes up more than 25% of the brain, the visual cortex does. And so when we think about that, how can we start to relate what that means in the mathematical construct? And many of you are probably already familiar with the CIE diagram, which is basically a mathematical way of thinking about the entire color space as can be seen by the human eye. And this is, if we start with this is really the theoretical limit for wide color gamut, because things beyond this, perhaps there are some animals on Earth that see in infrared and other colors, but we don't. And so making displays that have even wider color than this, at least for consumer applications, doesn't make a lot of sense. So how are we doing on this color spectrum and this color locus? Well, let's talk as well about what we see in the real world compared to this theoretical model. So Pointer was a very interesting paper done by Pointer back in the 1980s. And he went out and he measured what the real colors were that he could see off of reflected surfaces in nature, basically all objects. And it's an exhaustive study, and what he found was that this color space, and the locus represented by these points here, were what were the observable colors in nature. And so you'll notice that it's a somewhat smaller area than the entire visual space that can be perceived by the human visual cortex. But as it turns out, there are a lot of man-made colors that Pointer didn't measure, such as pure color LEDs, computer graphics, many other things, especially as we move now into better types of pigments. Notice one question earlier about printing. These things begin to stretch even beyond Pointer's gamut. So I'm quite sure if you did the revised version of Pointer's gamut study today, you would find it to be a little bit larger space than that. But nevertheless, this represents a measure of what the real world looks like, not just what the human eye can potentially perceive. So film is something that a lot of us grew up with. Maybe there's a few people in the audience too young to remember what that was. But film is basically an organic chemistry that allows us to record or trap light based on different layers of dyes that are put onto photosensitive silver halide molecules. And so when we look at film and we look at the different types of color space that can be rendered by film, it's pretty typical that you would have two types of primary colors for each of the primaries. So you'd have what would be called a fast green and a slow green, a fast red and a slow red, a fast blue and a slow blue. As a result, you wind up with about 6 primaries. And when we map those 6 primaries out for a typical film system, we see that they basically cover Pointer's gamut pretty accurately. And so, film did a pretty good job of representing the real world. Film had a number of problems, as we all know. Wasn't really very conducive to bringing into your living room to watch movies, etc. But in the movie theater, we did still have a very good experience with film. So then, move forward and we move to the flat panel display era. And the flat panel display area with sRGB as the color standard, we basically took a huge step backwards, and that's a fact, and it's undisputed. So the sRGB color space, which is the HD broadcast standard, now covers only 33% of the possible visual area that can be seen by the human eye. It only covers about 70% of Pointer's gamut, those colors that were measured by Pointer out there in nature. And you'll notice in particular that we have some very, very, clear things that are missing. So we're definitely missing the sky, for example, the color of water in the ocean. We're also missing fire engine red, there are many common colors that are missed by Rec. 709. So when you see these things on a conventional Rec. 709 display, you're completely missing what you would see in reality, and you don't feel like you're there, right? You feel like you're looking at a photo or looking through a window or something like that, but you're definitely not having the experience of being there and being present. So when we think about expanded color gamuts, there was one that Hollywood was definitely not satisfied with Rec. 709, and so at the same time, Hollywood needed to move away from film, and so with the innovations in cameras like Red and others, we started to see the digital production moving into the movie studio and away from film. So they needed a wider color gamut. So they voluntarily got together between various movie studios and created a standard called DCI-P3, or Digital Cinema Initiative. And this is really geared around projectors, for starters, digital projectors, used in controlled lighting environments. And so we're not talking about very bright images, we're not talking about emissive displays. This is really designed for, again, a replacement to film in the movie theaters. And it's certainly better than Rec. 709, but it's still lacking what film had in terms of its overall ability to render reality. And it also has some limitations relative to Pointer's gamut. So here we've got about 41% of Pointer's gamut covered, or 41% of the CIE covered, and 85% of Pointer's gamut. One of the interesting challenges is we see a lot of sets coming to market now with the so-called DCI-P3 color space, but there isn't a standard for DCI-P3 color broadcast today. And so again, this content is really, it's between the Hollywood studios and the movie theaters, and the movie theaters broadcast it. This is not a distribution standard. And so, there is sort of a mismatch here between what the broadcast standards are going to be, which is Rec. 709 today, and in the future moving Rec. 2020, versus this is something that Hollywood uses for their internal purpose in movie theaters. And then ultra-high definition. So ultra-high def specifies a very wide color gamut. As was noted earlier, about 150% of NTSC. It covers 76% of the area that can be seen by the human eye, and it basically covers 100% of Pointer's gamut. And when combined together with 4K, 8K pixels, higher dynamic range, 22.2 multi-channel sound, all of which are part of the high vision standard, you really feel like you're there. And NHK has had some demonstrations of this. I've seen them. It's fantastic. It's like being part of the experience, and it's very, very different than watching TV. So what can we do to try and make sure that this technology vision for super high vision is realized out there in the real world? First off, let me talk about how primary colors are created. Again, this was a topic touched on a little bit earlier, but we basically start with a white backlight, and then we filter out to achieve the primary colors. And the more pure the white backlight is in terms of its spectral peaks, the more efficient the entire system is, and the better the color rendering can be. So if we take a close look now at that, and we look at using a white LED, so this is a white LED backlight spectrum shown on the left, and we look at how we're going to turn that, for example, into green light in the LCD, that white backlight spectrum is passed through a green color filter, which in turn gives you this green bump. But as we can see, that green bump is not very green. It's got a lot of yellow, a lot of orange, a lot of other color in there. Now we can make it better by using thicker color filter deposition, a thicker layer of color filter. We can change the pigments to be more absorptive pigments. But all of these things cut down on the efficiency, which is the wrong direction to go as far as these systems are concerned. So when we think about, that's shown by the dashed line there. That's a so-called wide gamut color filter overlaid to a standard CF72 color filter. And so you can see that, yes, you do get a better looking bump on the green channel, but you also lose a significant amount of the light as a result of using that. So ideally, what we want to do is we want to use very transmissive color filters that do not have aggressive cutoff functions, and we want to have a very nice narrow spectral source in the backlight that meets up to the primaries, which are required for the color standard we're trying to render. So if we take a look at creating primary colors with the PD backlight, again, as previously discussed, we have a nice, narrow peak spectra of red, green, and blue, and that passes through, for example, the green channel passes through the green color filter, and you get this nice peaked red. And you can use that, relatively high pass or high bandwidth green color filter and still achieve a very narrow spectral distribution for your green channel with good peak performance. So how do you, realize this, or how would you use this in an actual set application? So here we have some existing color filters. These are CF72 class color filters off of a commercial product measured. In fact, it's the commercial product shown up here at the front of the room. They've basically been designed for an sRGB color space using a white LED backlight. And when we overlay that with the primaries that are required for Rec 2020, what we see is that the primaries for Rec 2020 are monochromatic sources, so pure spectral sources on the locus at 467, 532, and 630, which is very nice. However, monochromatic light sources are very expensive, not terribly power efficient. And so when we think about making a practical system out of this type of, for Rec 2020, how can we start to convert now to more practical light sources and reduce cost and improve power efficiency? Well, one thing we can certainly do is we can use blue LEDs, whose efficiency has become better and better over time. And now we start to get to a place where we've got about 50% or even 60% wall plug efficiency for blue LEDs. Sorry. So when we do that, we overlay the blue spectra from a blue LED instead of the blue monochromatic source at 467. What we see is that we've got a problem in the green channel. And that's because the blue LED is not a pure spectral source. It does have a tail. And so what we end up with is in the blue channel, we pick up quite a bit of the blue light leaking into the green. So how the green is going to look now is it's going to have this nice monochromatic peak, and then it's going to have this tail over here, which is in the blue, or the blue-green. And that's going to really corrupt our ability to produce good, high-quality color gamut. So what can we do about that? There's not a whole lot we can do about that with that set of color filters at that peak primary location of 467. But what we could do is we could shift that primary just slightly over deeper into the blue, so let's say 450. And when we move that primary into 450, we can definitely see that that improves our crosstalk issue here in the green channel quite significantly. And, again, different color filters, different tunings can be accomplished with this, but generally you can get to a place where you have pretty good performance in the blue channel without crosstalk into the green. And yes, you sacrifice something on the blue primary, but this can be addressed by some additional compensation that we're going to see elsewhere. So the second thing is, what do you do about that green, that very, very narrow green source? Well, one thing you can do is you can replace that with quantum dot that has an emission spectra or a full width half max of less than 30 nanometers. And when you do that, as shown on this diagram here, you have a very nice green channel. Again, you're picking up a little bit of the blue bleeding over in the green channel. And in the blue channel, you are picking up this tail. This long tail on the blue color filter is definitely being picked up, and that's definitely going to cause us some problems. But we've got a very nice red over here as well. When we replace the red source, go back one. So what can we do to further optimize this? Well, because we moved the blue, if we move the green a little bit too, then we wind up with a better blue-green primary. And so that improves, again, our color performance in terms of the CIE diagram. Now we want to overlay the red channel versus that red laser. And we can put that basically right at 630. That's pretty easy, again, with a very narrow full width half max red. And when we do the final color tuning, we find that, in point of fact, we move that red out a little bit to get the optimized color spectrum. And so what does this finally look like? We wind up with a color spectrum in, for example, a white quantum dot film that looks like this. It passes through these color filters. This is the blue, the green, and the red channel. And we end up with a 90% coverage of the Rec 2020 spectrum. And you can see that right here on these displays, which we'll have available as well after the talk if you want to take a look at different pictures with them. So that's all very interesting. Well, what we heard a little bit earlier about cadmium-free quantum dots. So what about cadmium-free quantum dots and moving to Rec 2020? Well, one of the things about the cadmium-free materials is, as was also noted earlier, you're rather restricted in terms of the material sets you can choose from that have a band gap in the near IR, which is really what you need if you're going to control the emission characteristics in red and green. And so we can see what those are. Those are, gallium arsenide is a real nice one, but nobody likes arsenic any better than they like cadmium, so that's out. Cad selenide, which we're using today, which people have had various different thoughts on the toxicity of that, or indium phosphide, which is here, cad telluride. There's others as well that might be useful, but nobody really knows how to synthesize them in a colloidal chemistry form. Or they contain other things like lead, which are also equally not of interest in terms of trying to make green chemistry. But because the band gap of indium phosphide is significantly lower than cad selenide, to make the same emission characteristic from an indium phosphide crystal, you need to make the crystal much smaller. And the smaller you make these crystals, the size and shape control becomes more and more difficult. And this is a principal issue with the cadmium-free materials, is that it is very, very difficult to achieve a full width half max below 30 nanometers. In fact, no one's ever demonstrated that that's possible. And it is also very difficult to put thick shells, which we haven't talked about terribly much here, but the thicker the shell material and the more robust the shell material is, the better the stability. So when we talk about putting materials into the LED cup, of course, a thick shell material, such as the work that's gone on at Los Alamos, this becomes very interesting for us. But the more shell you put on, the more redshift you have. So to make green, that means you've got to make a really, really small green core out of indium phosphide to get a thick shell on that. And even with the indium phosphide, it becomes difficult to get a very low wavelength green, such as a 520 nanometer green. So these are some of the limitations we see with non-cad selenide dots in terms of their ability to hit those primaries that are necessary to make Rec 2020. And sure, while it might be possible to meet some of the requirements of something like a DCI-P3 color space, again, that's not where the industry is going as far as future content and future broadcasts are concerned. So if we take a look, for example, at some real non-cad selenide quantum dots that were exhibited at CES, these are some spectra. I'm sorry for the quality of the graph here, it didn't translate very well. But these are spectra taken from the LG and Samsung sets on the show floor. And what we can see is that the Samsung set had a spectra of about 42 nanometers, full width half max on the green. And actually the red was much broader at 57. And this allowed about a 92% coverage of DCI-P3. The LG spectrum, which we understood from the LG booth people, was that was a red-only quantum dot film, and it had a red full width half max of 64 nanometers, and the green was basically coming from a green phosphor at 51 nanometers. And that didn't even quite meet 90% of DCI-P3, and certainly not close to anything coming close to Rec 2020. So, we, of course, as well, are very interested in developing other types of material systems and have invested heavily in developing CAD-free materials. And these are actually CAD-free materials that we have. And we have basically a 40 nanometer green and a 46 nanometer red, and can basically get to 100% of DCI-P3 with our cadmium-free materials. But it's really not good enough. There's efficiency losses. The cad selenide materials have much higher efficiency in the film products than the cadmium-free materials. And secondly, and this full width half max question is not at all to be taken lightly, when you have full width half maxes in the 40s, the ability to hit those Rec 2020 color specs is really compromised. And so as we'll see here, if we put our Nanosys best-in-class CAD-free materials into those same color filters, we basically see that we've got a tremendous amount of crosstalk from both the red and the blue channel now into the green. The green is much, much wider and crosstalks into the red. and the crosstalk into the blue is also much worse. And so while you may be able to deal with the red a little bit by shifting the red out this way, there'll be tremendous photopic losses the deeper you slide that red. What you're really trying to do by doing that is move that knee right there. The more you move that knee that way and this peak this way, you're going to lose about 1% per nanometer as that red shifts deeper. And again, loss of efficiency is really not something that we need to be doing in our display products. So according to our simulations and actual modeling, very, very difficult to reach above 82% Rec 2020 coverage without a significant change in the color filter, which would impact the efficiency, or a much lower wavelength green, which also no one has demonstrated their ability to do, and or a major improvement in full width half max, which we also haven't seen. So, and last but not least is with the broader red, it turns out, again, because of the reabsorption issue that was mentioned in the talk about rods, the more quantum dots you add, you actually start to lose efficiency quite rapidly. So if you really want to make the D65 white point, which is what's required for the Rec 2020 spec, you just can't add enough of this red to actually get to D65. You actually start to see the brightness go down as the thing warms up, because the more red dots you put in to try and boost the red signal level, the more reabsorption you start to get from the green. So, what else can we do? Clearly, we've seen that the CAD selenide quantum dots are a superior solution for the Rec 2020 color gamut. The materials are, as we heard earlier, fully allowed by legislative act of the European Union in all geographies now. There's been many studies done at great expense. We've done many studies ourselves as well, proving about the toxicity or lack of toxicity of these materials. So, CAD selenide quantum dots look like a great way to achieve 90 to 94% of Rec 2020, but what can we do to get beyond that? And so one of the fundamental things is this limitation on this blue color filter. And we don't really need a more aggressive color filter, but this little bump basically caused by this long tail here is really killing the blue color channel. And so being able to suppress that bump with what we would propose is a slightly different configuration of color filter, which basically doesn't involve putting more of the same color filter material down, but actually changing to a different pigment. And we believe, based on the work that we've been doing, that pigment change can actually allow for a more transmissive blue color filter. But by shifting this color filter cutoff slope basically towards the UV, our simulations clearly show that we can get to 97, 98, even 99% of the Rec 2020 coverage. And that together perhaps with some definition change around exactly what the locus is for the primaries, we believe you can get to 100% compliance to Rec 2020 using this material set. So in conclusion, Rec 2020 LCDs have been demonstrated now by both 3M and by Nanosys with greater than 90% coverage of the target gamut. Our mainstream CF72 color filters are used, so they're very highly transmissive, very efficient. You can see the display is very bright. And with some slight modifications to the color filter materials, we believe that more than 95% of Rec 2020 should be easily achievable within a year using these CAD selenide quantum dots. CAD selenide QD film also offers a practical and cost-effective solution for UHD TVs with Rec 2020 and high color gamut and high dynamic range because of the nature of the direct backlit system that the high end of the UHD spectrum is moving towards. And as we've seen from this conference today, certainly, quantum dots have already emerged from being a novelty material to a commercial product. More and more commercial products arriving on the market every day. QDs and quantum dot films are being manufactured on a large scale with robust supply chain for the LCD industry. And so with all of these things combined, we look forward to seeing CAD selenide quantum dots have quite a robust lifetime moving forward into the future and being the technology of choice for Rec 2020 compliant displays as those come to the market very very shortly. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
It's Richard Austin from Gamut Scientific. With the availability of laser diodes of the 450 nanometer region and higher flux densities, could these be used as drivers for the quantum dot for the region? There's been, what's the flux density of these quantum dot materials?
Yeah, so this goes to a question of where you put the quantum dots relative to the stimulation source. So when we think about laser systems, typically they're scanning systems, and you'll have a blue laser diode, for example, scanning across an array at a very high rate of speed. In that kind of configuration, if we put quantum dots in the optical path between the laser and the projection surface, quantum dots are, as was mentioned by 3M earlier, they're a wonderful diffuser source because they're an isotropic emitter. But they would completely ruin your ability to do laser projection because the second you hit one, the light goes in all directions. And so we can't really think about using them in a conventional sense as far as a scanning laser type of application. We could think about, all right, can we drive a backlight or some other sort of a large area illuminator with a laser? In that case, yes, of course. We could envision different architectures where we have a laser instead of LEDs driving that backlight source. It becomes a question of where the quantum dots are put relative to the laser source. So we can put them on the surface of of something like a light guide plate or the analogy to the light guide plate in that system. And the flux density there isn't going to be any different than what you have today. If we put them on the laser diode chip, it's going to be even higher than what we see in terms of the ultimate solution that Seth talked about earlier, putting them onto the LED itself. And so putting them onto the laser diode itself will be even more of a challenge than integrating with the LED package, which again, we haven't seen anyone successfully do so far.
Go ahead.
Carrying from two technology, one comment on PCI spec first for the color spectrum. It's specifically designed to match the CL line broadband backlight because the projector is not using LED whatever, they're using the CL lamp. So the color mapping on the PCI was purposely matching the CL lamp visual spectrum capability to get the maximum resolution in 45 pixels on the screen. So that's the reason why the Horman was there that way. So the VIC 2020 is a different game. The DCI is for cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not for LCD.
Same questions is capture. Problem right now that yes, you can do high color saturations, but the full dial and digital capture became a problem because the photon efficiency on the red color getting really low versus film. So you can capture saturated color, but capture no photons on production. So what you have is artificial color generation slide for productions. None of them is real.
So, your points are ones in physics, so I'm not going to argue with them. But what I'll tell you is that anybody seen the movie Gravity? Show of hands. Every frame in that entire movie of Sandra Bullock's face is computer generated. Did you all know that? She was put into what's called a light field display, and her face was mapped, completely mapped. It's an interesting process. A professor out of USC pioneered it. But basically what happens is the face, because of the different levels of skin, has different absorption to different light. And so if you go out in the sunlight, your skin looks one color. If you're in this kind of illuminant, your skin looks very different. So what they did was they basically mapped how Sandra's face looked under every illuminant across every facial expression that she could make. And they stored that in a database. And they computer generated her entire expression base, all of her facial expressions, everything in the movie. There isn't one single filmed shot of her in that movie. So I think our perspective on how movies are going to get made in the future is very different. Avatar is another example of that. So whereas, yes, you may be, if you remain in the paradigm of movies need to be filmed with a camera out on a set somewhere, yeah, that may be true, but I don't think that's where the future of this technology is headed. In which case, you need massive color volume, because your ability to make on screen a red that you just can't see that intensity of red in real life, that's there. That's very real, and that's going to be in the color palette and the toolkit that the content producers are going to develop.
We have one more, but I asked for the exchange to be brief, please.
Yeah, so I see the bandwidth that you listed up there for RGB. So the range between 60-ish and 40-ish nanometer. So can you elaborate the challenge of getting the bandwidth narrower? So what is involved in this? What is the significance of that, especially in terms of particle size control and particle size uniformity, I guess. Thank you.
I could, but I think it's going to take a lot longer than I probably have left in the session. But suffice it to say that if, let's just use this analogy, right? If a cat selenide quantum dot is the size of a beach ball, and your ability to control additional new atoms joining that is, 3 tennis balls, right? Then your overall size impact of plus or minus 3 tennis balls on the size of a beach ball is something, right? On the other hand, if your ball now is the size of a tennis ball and you can control plus or minus 3 tennis balls, then you got a big problem in terms of your particle size variance. It's your particle size variance that really is an issue here. It's not necessarily an absolute, it's basically what the variance becomes, because that variance contributes to what this spectral narrowness or broad breadth is. So hopefully that is a simple answer to your question, but it's a lot more complicated than that, but I don't know. Seth, you buy that answer? No, not at all. Okay.
Let's thank our speaker one more time.
All right. Thank you.